I met a guy on Tinder and all was going great, so we decided to meet in person. He asked me if I wanted to spend the night and I said yes, as we all had mutual friends, so I told myself that he was definitely someone that I could trust. I arrived at his house around 9 p.m. and immediately realised he wasn't what I thought. He was dirty, his apartment looked like a squat, and there was a smell of stale tobacco in every room. The first thing I noticed going in was a stack of books on autism. So I asked him about them, and he then went on to tell me that he's autistic with Asperger's and that he has difficulty differentiating right from wrong. He also said that he knows how to analyse non-verbal language very well, and that he knows what a person is thinking just by their body language. Now, I don't know anything about neurodivergence, but I directly wondered what his inability to recognise right from wrong meant. He offered me a glass of alcohol, which I accepted, and as I followed him into the kitchen, I saw a weapon that was placed on the counter. I was a little panicked when I saw this, as anyone would be, and seeing my look, he explained to me that it wasn't charged and it belonged to his father. I never knew if it was real or not, but regardless, I was beginning to feel a little uneasy. When we'd spoken on Tinder, he told me that he wrote quite a bit, like me, so he showed me a poem he'd written on his computer. The poem consisted of him recounting the rape of a child in quite precise detail, and I freaked out. I pretended to appreciate his talent, because now he was really starting to scare me. We then talked about his ex, and he told me that they had fun choking and drowning each other in the shower because they wanted to know what it felt like to have control over the other's life. It was too much by this point. I had swept away a lot of red flags in just a few hours, but I just wanted to leave. However, there was a problem. I said I'd sleep at his house. I had to find a plausible excuse to leave without him thinking I was fleeing the situation, and I was afraid that he had bad intentions and would come after me if he thought I was afraid, and that I understood his little game. I discreetly sent a message to my father with the address of where I was, so that he could come and get me immediately. And I explained to the boy that ultimately I couldn't stay, and I was really upset I couldn't stay longer. I played it to perfection, if I do say so myself. We were both in bed and I was just constantly looking at my phone, waiting for only one thing, to find out when my father was going to be there. At one point he asked me if I was in a hurry to leave, because he'd noticed that I was looking at my phone regularly. I was scared because I remembered him saying he knew what a person was thinking just by looking at them, so I told myself that he was going to take action if I didn't hide my fear. I managed to make him believe, at least I thought so, that everything was fine and that I was in absolutely no hurry to leave. He offered me a massage, which I tried to refuse, but not wanting him to understand my discomfort, especially since I was soon out of here, I accepted. I found myself in my underwear with him on top of me, and it was horrible. Then just as he was about to touch my chest, my phone rang, saved by the bell. My father was in front of his house. I quickly got dressed and barely said goodbye to him as I left the apartment. Then I sent him one last message explaining that I didn't want to follow up because his behaviour really freaked me out. Then I blocked him. One of my friends matched with him on Tinder a few days later and offered for them to come and sleep at his place. I warned my friend and she didn't follow up on him. Be careful on Tinder. You never really know a person. I really want to see other people's reaction to this meeting that I had with a guy from Bumble. I, a 30-year-old female, matched with this guy who was 41, and we started talking via text and calls for about 2 weeks before meeting in person. We got along really well, so eventually we went on an in-person date. We went to a brewery by his house, and it was great at first. The conversation came easy. Then he invited me back to his place to watch a movie as it was fairly nearby. Now, one thing to note, I had told him previously that I didn't want to have sex on the first date, just to avoid that expectation. so I expected to literally just watch a movie. When we got to his place, he was immediately touchy and affectionate. I gave him a kiss and we made out for a second before he told me to go to his room. I really regret not speaking up for myself and saying no. It was just an awkward situation for me, so I just went. This is when it got super weird. During the sex, he was so cringy, saying things like, "Who's my princess?" and "Whose pussy is this?" He was then saying it was so good he wasn't going to let me leave, and he said it multiple times. He then proceeded to say he was keeping my underwear, to which I said no, but he insisted, and I felt there was nothing I could do about it. I literally just wanted to leave. I felt so weird and unsafe and just gross. I told him I was taking my underwear back, so I did, and he remained naked for a while as I got dressed. I told him I needed to go. He got dressed and I left. Does anyone else think he was absolutely weird and creepy? This happened about 5 years ago, and I just felt like I wanted to share this with someone. Also with the hope it can help other people in a similar situation. I had just gotten out of a 2-year-long relationship, living in the city I'd moved to my then boyfriend for. After he'd left, I felt lonely and heartbroken. I was stuck in the apartment we had shared, so I downloaded Tinder to chat to guys as a way of coping with the breakup. I matched with this guy who was about 4 years older than me. He was extremely handsome and charming, was very much into fitness and had an amazing body. After talking for a few days, he asked to meet, so we did. He came over to my house, and I was immediately attracted to him. He was a bad boy, the kind I usually go for, but he was also very sweet in the way he talked to me. He kept complimenting me and doing sweet stuff. After a few days of meeting, we ended up having sex, and it was honestly the best sex I'd ever had. I felt this intense chemistry between us, so we started hanging out and having sex a lot. At the time I was smoking a lot of weed, and I know he smoked too and did some other drugs, but I didn't really care much at the time. Eventually he would keep asking me to hang out pretty much every day, begging me to come over because he missed me. When I told him I was too tired, he would bribe me with stuff, like saying he would give me massages, weed, dinner, romantic things, give me the best night, etc., etc. But he didn't like it when I told him no. He would sometimes get angry, send me a bunch of messages just pleading for me to come over, and after every time I had been to his house, he would shower me with love via messages. He was so romantic, saying I made him feel so amazing, there was something special about me, and that he loved being with me. He would often shower me with compliments, but then get angry when I said I didn't have time to hang out with him. One time I was at his house. He got a phone call from someone. After he'd hung up, he told me I had to go upstairs and hide, because his baby's mama was coming over. He didn't want her to see me because she was crazy, and he told me some stories of mad things she'd apparently done. I believed him, and he was very convincing, and I believed this happened twice. Now I know I should have seen the red flags. I probably did to some extent, but I didn't care much. I kept hanging out with him a lot, even though I figured out he was heavy on drugs like coke and speed. One day I was at his house and we'd had sex. I'd smoked a lot. He was on coke and probably some other stuff, and he wanted to have sex again. But he got frustrated that he couldn't get it up. He got mad and blamed it on me not being firm enough on the grip. So yelled at me to squeeze it harder, and he just kept getting more frustrated. I felt uncomfortable and wanted to leave, but he wanted me to stay, trying to continue, but it didn't work. I was extremely uncomfortable now and felt embarrassed, so after a while I told him I wanted to leave. He then told me to give him back the weed he'd given me, as in his mind it was his payment to me being with him. I honestly felt so pissed that I had just grabbed my stuff and walked out the door, but he followed me. At first he walked calmly about 30 meters behind me, begging me to stay with him and asking where I was going. But I kept walking and saying no, when suddenly he then ran towards me. I picked up my phone to call a friend of mine, because I could tell he was getting aggressive. Then I turned around and saw him literally tear his shirt open, stomping towards me. He grabbed my phone out of my hands, then kicked me in my stomach so hard I fell into a ditch. He then smashed my phone to the ground and told me, "You're done." I thought he was going to beat me up, but then it looked like he was actually trying to contain himself for a second. Then he turned around and left. I was mortified by what he had done, and I ran away shaking. I can't even remember how I got home, but somehow I did. I was able to borrow a phone from someone and called my friend who came over. I had bruises on my stomach and legs and had no phone. I also called the police using a friend's phone and told them I wanted to press charges. A few days later, he messaged me saying I'd tried to steal from him, that I took advantage of him just to get some weed. A few hours later, he texted me saying sorry. Then a few more hours after that, he texted asking what had happened to me yesterday. A week later, he'd found out I had reported him to the police and was mad. He said he couldn't believe I'd reported him, but he would give me 2 new phones or whatever I wanted if I withdrew it. Also that he wouldn't contact me anymore if I did. He just didn't want any trouble and didn't want to lose his daughter. But I didn't reply, and he then sent another message fabricating the whole story of what had happened that night. He kept harassing me for weeks with messages, some days begging us to get back together or be friends, bribing me. Other days he was accusing me of random stuff and calling me names, etc. He said he had a great lawyer and that he would report me to the police for stuff I'd never actually done. He kept acting like a smartass, saying he would beat me in court, and it all just became chaos. After a few months, there was a trial, but I couldn't attend physically, so I testified via a phone call. I was questioned about our relationship and the incident that night. He lied and made up stories about me, but no one believed him. And after the trial was done, I received all the papers in the mail. I was in shock when I read it. He had previously been charged with violence and rape towards his ex, and apparently there was also an incident where he'd forced his ex-girlfriend to touch herself while multiple other men watched and videotaped her. There were other girls too that had experienced similar things. Stuff like robbery, weapons, fights, violence and torture, you name it. He had been to jail multiple times. I had no idea I had been dealing with such a dangerous man. I'm pretty sure he's a psychopath. He has no understanding of what he has done, and the sick part is, I recently came across a post about him on Facebook. Apparently he is pretty popular with women lately on Snapchat and Instagram. He posts stuff about his life, whining about being beaten up by random men, being tortured and robbed, etc. The people follow him with guns. But I have learned that the reason he keeps getting beaten up by people is because they know what he has done. He posted pictures of himself at the hospital to make people feel bad for him, and they do. It makes women feel sorry for him. He says people lie and make up stories about him, and he gains pity. He then posts all the sweet replies and messages girls send him, saying stuff like he feels so grateful for all the support. He is extremely good at manipulating people. I honestly feel so lucky that I got away at the time I did, and that it didn't escalate any further. I checked his Facebook, and apparently he has a girlfriend now. I just pray he doesn't hurt her in any way. As a teenager, I waited tables in a local restaurant to pay for gas for my car. I met a guy we'll call Mr. Creep there, and in my naive mind he seemed normal at first, despite the fact that he was 20 and wanted to date a 17-year-old girl. Leaving my job after dark scared me, so I taught myself to get in my car, shut the door and lock it in one fluid motion, and it made me feel safer. One night I was leaving for work and had just gotten into my car, when Mr. Creep seemed to just appear out of nowhere, yanking my door handle to try and open it. I looked into his eyes in the split second before he smiled, and what I saw absolutely chilled my bones. I don't know how to describe the evil I saw. From then on, I was terrified of him, but I didn't let on because I was afraid of what he might do if I told him I never wanted to see him again. After this, he constantly lied to try to impress me and tried to invent ways of being alone with me, but my instinct always was to run, so I avoided him as much as possible. About 2 weeks after this incident, the restaurant got robbed and there was significant evidence against Mr. Creep, just not the kind that allowed the cops to charge him. I sent all of my text conversations with Mr. Creep to the police in hopes it would help, but he slithered away after that, and I always looked over my shoulder. About 5 years ago, he messaged me on Facebook out of the blue, going on about his top-secret military clearance, as well as the huge acreage he owned. It made me nervous, and I felt like he was trying to spring a trap or something, but I tried to put it out of my mind. When today I was looking at posts about an unsolved murder, and I saw his mugshot. He is now facing murder charges, as well as 2 other violent felony charges. I am so glad to know he's locked up, but so overwhelmed at how correct my instincts about him were. I feel like I've escaped him. My name is Janelle and I'm a 21-year-old French girl student in Lille, France. Tired of not finding true love, I decided to lose my virginity with my best friend. Then I found a fantastic friend with benefits, with which I got on wonderfully on all levels. It lasted for 3 months, then it all stopped because he was still in love with his ex. Sensitive as I am, that was when I made my first suicide attempt, ending up in A&E, then the mental hospital. For the smart ones among you, you will have understood that I was already struggling with depression, undergoing treatment, and I had a strong penchant for alcohol. To complete this auto-destruction mechanism, what better than dating apps? A few weeks after my release from the mental hospital, I met up with a few guys, just for company, and especially to forget my dear friend with benefits. I'd always meet the guys at home for a first date, because I have 0 experience, so that's what happened when I met my very first date. One day came when I matched with a guy, let's call him Matthew. Now Matthew was not very good looking and had a few extra pounds, but I'm no Beyonce either, so we matched. We laughed a little, had some common tastes, and he smoked weed, so I thought, perfect plan to smoke some joints between sex. He gave me some personal information like his address, no idea if it was a real one. And he told me what his job was, though he'd just been fired. But work or not work, I didn't care. I wasn't looking for anything long-term with him. I explained that I was sensitive, that I'd just come out of a mental clinic, and that I was depressed, etc. It was basically all for the sole purpose of making him understand not to mess with me. I also told him that I was looking for just a sexual relationship, but still with discussion, complicity, and hugs, etc., and not just a shot in 20 minutes and it's done. He assured me that this was what he was looking for too, and that he was actually very cuddly. Perfect. After only 1 or 2 days of discussion, we agreed on a date, a mojito party at my house, and he brought some joints. Matthew arrived, and he was really not cute, even worse than in the photos. He had a very dirty look with greasy hair and stained t-shirt, looking like a teenager despite being 26 years old. In short, I was far from wetting my pants, but I desperately needed company. I offered him to make the drinks whilst I chose a film to watch. He went into the kitchen to prepare 2 mojitos before joining me on the sofa. We talked a bit. He wasn't very smart or very interesting, so I drowned in my drink, hoping to animate the party alone, which ended up in a 3-day binge and blackout for me. So according to our dear Matthew, we drank and smoked whilst watching the movie before going into the bedroom. I vaguely remember being naked on my bed and seeing him dressed above me, looking at me before turning his heels and slamming the door. My phone wasn't charging, my alarm was not ringing, and I hadn't made it to a work group appointment, so my colleagues were worried and called me. But they couldn't get through, so they contacted my sister, but she also went to voicemail. The girls from work came to my house and rang again and again, but there was no answer. They'd even called the fireman, who managed to open the bottom door, but not the door to my apartment. They knocked on the door calling out to me, and I eventually opened up, dressed in a blanket to hide my nakedness. I looked at them with complete incomprehension. The fireman just concluded that I was hungover and left my friends to help me get dressed. They also thought I'd drunk too much, but they noticed that my body was covered with yellow betadine on my arms, legs, and stomach, etc. I told them that I'd burned my arm yesterday and that I wanted to heal myself, but there were no signs of a burn or anything on my arm. Besides, I don't even own betadine. One of my friends took me and my cat home with them, as I was in quite a comatose state, having trouble speaking and looking completely elsewhere as I had been anesthetized, and I even seemed to have trouble thinking. The next day my sister came to pick me up so that I could stay with her for a few days. But everyone was convinced that I'd tried to kill myself with drugs and alcohol. I started complaining about pain in my vulva and blood loss, though my pill stops my period completely, so my sister took me to the hospital, where I explained that having been unconscious and not taken my pill, I may be unprotected. I was advised to file a complaint and was redirected to the OB emergency. The next day I finally regained full consciousness slowly, and my relatives came to see me right away. I was a little more lively where they met me in the gyne emergency, and I got swabs and preventative AIDS treatment done. Over the course of a week I made a series of appointments for blood samples, urine samples, etc., and I went to file a complaint with the police with my friends, who met me at home, and my sister took care of me. After talking about it around people my age, older people, but especially medical staff and the police, the term organ trafficking was mentioned more than once, and I think the guy just chickened out at the last minute. However, despite telling the police everything, my bed full of betadine, my underwear torn off, and the blood on the doors of my apartment, my attacker got nothing, and I will never know what really happened and what he really wanted. A bunch of years ago, I matched with a guy on Tinder. I was a freshman in college and had just gotten out of a relationship, so was just having fun. This guy was 24 years old, who we'll call D, and he was a little odd, but we had similar interests and went to the same school, so I thought, why not? The red flags started rolling in immediately when I said I would go on a date with him, and of course the fact that he was much older than me wasn't lost on me as the initial red flag. At this time I didn't have a car, so D offered to pick me up, but told me that he wasn't in town but would leave his grandmother's funeral early, which was at a minimum 5 hours away, to come and pick me up. He showed up in sweatpants, a wife beater and flip-flops, which struck me as odd because he said he was coming from a funeral. We hadn't made plans, just to get a bite to eat and hang out as he had been out of town. He asked if it was okay if we stopped to pick up his dog, who he's left with a friend. I like dogs, so I had no problem with that. It was dark and we pulled up to an apartment complex where he left me in the car and came back with a golden retriever. The dog immediately started growling at me, which had never happened to me before, so I started feeling a little bit weird. Dee didn't say anything about the dog's temperament, but because we now have the dog, he wanted to drop him off at his house, which felt logical to me, so I agreed. When we pulled up to Dee's house, he asked if I wanted to come in, so not wanting to sit in the car, I did. However, the moment I walked in, I immediately knew it was the wrong choice. The house was trashed. There was garbage everywhere. Trash bags full along the front entry, bottles and wrappers on the couch, and just general crap everywhere. Dee let me know he had a roommate, but that roommate wasn't home, so I assumed this was to imply that the mess wasn't his. After brushing the trash off the couch, he asked if I wanted to sit and play chess. I had expressed that I was interested in learning, and he seemed more than happy to help me. But this too was a mistake. Dee began explaining the game to me, but it wasn't fun first date explaining. He had gotten really serious and was showing me each piece, telling me what it is, what it does, and how it moves. Dee then began questioning me over each piece, which most of I got wrong, and every time I got one wrong he yelled at me the correct answer and told me to try again. He got more and more frustrated, and it made me very uncomfortable, so I suggested we paused the chess and did something else. Dee suggested watching a movie, which was fine with me. The idea of us leaving and going to get food seemingly forgotten. Dee told me we would watch the movie in his room, and I obliged, but then he explained that he had to put clean sheets on the bed. I assumed we were moving to his bedroom because it may have been cleaner, but when we went in it wasn't, and there was no TV in his room. He proceeds to put Iron Man 2 onto his phone to have us watch, and it was only 10 minutes in before things got sexual. I won't tell you the details, but short story short, we didn't have sex, but other things went down, and those things were consensual. After they occurred, I felt really odd about the whole situation, and told him I didn't want to have sex. Dee was confused, but didn't push it. He said fine, and we watched maybe 5 more minutes of the movie, before he said he didn't want to watch it anymore. He started complaining and asking me why I didn't want to have sex with him, to which I simply said I wasn't in the mood anymore. He then began pressuring me to tell him exactly what it was about him that made me feel that way. At this point, we had moved from the bedroom back into the dirty living room, and you might be thinking that seemed like the perfect time to leave, and I thought so too. But this was where things started to get scary. It was as if he knew I was thinking about leaving, and he exploded and began to scream at me. Now this is a 6-foot-something man screaming in the face of a 5-foot-nothing young girl, so of course I was internally freaking out. But I was trying to make sure I didn't piss him off more, but also not agreeing to anything. He started yelling about why no one likes him, why no one wants to get to know him, and why no one loves him, saying that he had never had a girlfriend, and all his dates have been one-night stands. Again I placate him with a I don't know. Lots of girls are just snooty like that. At this point I was saying anything and everything he wanted to hear, and he even started crying about how his mother never loved him, and telling me very deep dark things about what his mother had said to him and how she treated him. After he finally calmed down once more, he got up and went to the kitchen to fix us some drinks. Now if you're anyone with a brain, you're thinking absolutely not, which was my exact thought at that moment, and I declined his multiple offers for a drink. He asked if instead of alcohol I wanted water, and of course I declined that too, feigning that I wasn't thirsty. I stayed at his apartment until about 1 a.m, because I was sitting next to him, terrified to 1, ask him to take me home, 2, say I'd walk home, and 3, figure out how to get an Uber. I had been trying to download it on my phone without him noticing, but then it asked for card information, and that was too hard to do without him noticing. So around 1 a.m. I yawned very loudly and said, "Oh wow, it's 1 a.m. My roommate's going to be so worried about me." I laughed as if my roommate would be stupid to worry and that I hadn't been watching the clock since he'd picked me up at 9 p.m, then said, "I'm so tired, I should get home soon." Again, I was super scared he would freak out, but he didn't explode this time. He just looked at the clock and said that yeah, it was late, but I was not going to take any chances, so I said, "I have a great idea. If I get to bed soon, I'd love to have breakfast with you on campus." I was hoping my offer convinced him that I was intending to see him again, and it did, as he seemed very happy at the prospect of it, then jumped up and walked me out of the house to his car. The drive back was excruciatingly long, and was in complete silence. Neither of us said a word. It was only a 10-minute drive, but I could have sworn he slowed down every time we got to a particularly dark area or underpass. Dee dropped me off and I smiled and made a good show of being tired, yet excited to see him tomorrow. He offered multiple times to walk me to my door, but I declined every time, and said I didn't want to bother him and I'd see him tomorrow. I walked myself to the building, and the moment I got round the corner, I sprinted so fast up the steps and to my door before he could change his mind and follow me. And when I got into my dorm room, I genuinely felt like I had just escaped a serial killer. Even now writing it makes my heart race a bit. I never met up with him the next morning, but he begged me for multiple days after to meet up with him again, even asking to pay me $20 an hour to sit near me in the library. I declined, obviously, and only ever saw him once at the gym on campus. He didn't see me and I left immediately. I've thought about Dee occasionally since the date and wondered if all those girls he had one-night stands with had had the same experience that I did. I still sometimes wonder how many girls there were after me. I used a dating site to hopefully find a decent person to go out with and tried to make a connection. But this particular dating site sadly had a lot of duds and very, very few decent folk available. However, I remained optimistic and kept going back to check messages when I received a message from a normal-looking guy who seemed to have a lot of good things going for him. After a bit of talking, I felt really comfortable giving him my personal phone number, something I rarely ever do. And we talked on the phone and found we had many things in common. Both of us were nerdy and had some form of collection of nerdy things, so at that point I really wanted to meet him in person. We set up a day to go out for some brunch at a local place, and he told me he was excited to meet me. I told him that I was excited too. On the day of the date, we had our lovely brunch and talked about various things. He was an extremely tall guy and built like an ox. It was almost a little intimidating. But I do like me some tall guys, so that didn't bother me much. After some time talking, he got a text from his mum asking him where he was, and that she needed him to come help her with his dad. He told me after the conversation with his mum that his dad was not doing well, and was basically in hospice care at home. I gave my condolences and said it was fine to cut the date off short so he could go take care of his dad. I even told him I'd like to see him again sometime soon when he was able to, which he felt the same about. As we left the restaurant and I headed for my car and ended up stopping for a short time to converse a little longer, but then all of a sudden he asked me if I wanted to feel him. I was taken aback by what he'd said and asked him what he meant. It was so out of nowhere that I didn't think he meant his groin, so I looked around nervously from the parking lot, looking to see if there was anyone nearby that I could potentially flag down for help. Sadly, there was no one, and so my attention turned back to him. Afraid of what he might do, and him waiting there expectantly for me to touch him, I shakily reached my hand and tried to aim not directly upon his crotch, and then announced that yes, I sure could feel it. I laughed nervously and lied, but then he forcefully grabbed my hand and brought it to his groin. Thankfully, I still didn't feel it, as I still kind of aimed offset. He asked me if I felt it now, and I lied once again and said yeah, I felt it. I was so afraid and was at a loss for words. He towered over me like a skyscraper. If he wanted to, he could have easily lifted me up, put a hand over my mouth and shoved me into his car without breaking a sweat. To cut the awkward silence, I said, "Well, I'd better go now." He said goodbye and left to go to his car, and I torpedoed into my own car and locked the door as soon as I sat on the seat. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel and I headed home, glancing into my rear mirror to make sure he had not followed me. When I got home, I washed my hands thoroughly, even though I didn't actually touch him. It was just the thought of it that made me sick, and washing my hands made me feel at least slightly better than before. After that day, I never texted him back or answered his phone call. Now, here's where things got more scary. So I knew what his name was, and he had mentioned what his dad's name was. but on my own I discovered what his middle and last name happened to be. I then used his full name to look up any sort of criminal record or any information I could obtain about him. I needed to know everything, especially if he was a criminal. And the first thing I saw, with his full name on, was an article about a woman whose body was found on the side of the highway in a sleeping bag or a black bag. As I read the full article, I noticed certain names being used. First off, his name. It matched. Then later in the article, after reading about what he had done to the woman, they had a portion where the journalist spoke with his parents. Then his dad's nickname came up, the same name he told me his dad's was. To seal the deal that this was the same guy, was that the dates and his age matched up. He went to prison for only 10 years or less. When he got on the dating site and talked to me, he must have just gotten out of prison about a month before. It all hit me like a ton of bricks at once. I just went on a date with a man who killed a woman, and he never told me. Had I known beforehand, I never ever would have gone out on a date with him. I would have never given him my personal number. Since then, I've hoped he hadn't searched for my address, and suffice to say, I rested uneasy for months since discovering his crime. This story kind of creeped me out, and it happened about 9 years ago. It sometimes comes to my mind and creeps me out all over again. I was on an adult dating site, one of the fetish types. I know, don't judge me. I was just looking for some fun. And I was stupid and gave out more information than I should have. I was chatting with a guy who asked me at some point what I did for work. At the time, I was working at McDonald's, so I told him that. He asked which one, and I stupidly told him. We chatted on and off for not very long, and I'd also stupidly given him my phone number at some point. He would talk about how he wanted to meet me on my break and have some fun. So I told him no thanks, as I don't bring my private life to work. One night I checked my messages just before I was due to clock out of work, and I'm so glad I did. He'd messaged me to say he was there and told me what he'd ordered. I think it was a Big Mac meal. And I was like, okay, well, don't expect me to do anything with you, I'm not interested. Then he got upset and wouldn't accept that I wasn't interested. I was also scared now because I had sent him a picture of myself, but I had never received one from him. I really wasn't that interested in him, so I didn't want a picture, thinking I was likely not going to meet up with him anyway. His interests weren't what I was looking for, and I had a hard time saying I wasn't interested, so would just slowly start to ghost whoever I didn't care about. Now luckily I hadn't told him my work schedule, so he didn't know that I was about to clock out. So after clocking out, I told one of my managers my situation, and I had no idea what he looked like, so I was going to need to hang out in the back in the break room for a bit. Luckily she didn't judge me and was just like, oh, okay. So I waited about half an hour before I left, but didn't have a car at the time, so I had to walk home and was afraid he would see me and try to pick me up in his car. Thankfully no one followed me, so I was in the clear. I don't think he ever messaged me, and I ended up blocking him. I don't know if this really is all that creepy, but it scares me that some random person just decided that he would show up to my job and expect me to want to meet him. Now I just give vague responses as to where I work, and I don't work in the same town I live in, so it would be hard to pinpoint my exact location. This was an eye-opener, and made me more aware of the information I give out to strangers. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed the stories in this episode. Please let me know what your views are, and hit that like and subscribe button. Until next time, keep being creepy.